Hello, everybody. This is our third webinar in the Slavic mythology series. And welcome, all of you, no matter where you are in the world. If this is the first time for you to join us at the center webinars, you have to be prepared for a little spiel I have to give. And then we'll actually get into the topic of our meeting. So starting with the formalities, we are at the University of Florida. My name is Agata Kowalewska, and I'm faculty in the Center for the European Studies. The center is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and Title VI National Research Center for Europe. My apologies. The center is housed in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and we are multidisciplinary area language studies unit. While we are doing the webinar, we are also recording it, and it will be available for review at our center website and the YouTube channel. For everybody who is interested in asking questions, please use the Q&A that is at the bottom of the screen. And what are we doing today? So you know that this is about Slavs, and we are going to continue our conversation about Slavs. And Dr. Enrique Santos Marinas will talk about afterlife and the cult of death in pre-Slavic or Slavic pre-Christian religion. Our speaker today is from Madrid, the University of Complutense in Madrid. He is a secretary of the Spanish Society for Science of Religion. He's a member of Executive Committee of Spanish Society of Byzantine Studies. He's also a co-author of the book Rituals in Slavic Pre-Christian Religions, Festivals, Banquets, and Divination, together with our speaker, who will be presenting in April. Dr. Marinas is also, he also collaborated in the collective letters work on sources of the studies of Slavic pre-Christian religions. And he's interested in very diverse areas of pre-Slavic or Slavic pre-Christian religions, Christianity of Slavs, and medieval Slavic literature. The last thing I would like to remind you before we start with Dr. Enrique Santos Marinas is after the webinar is over, you will receive the survey, and I highly encourage you to complete the survey so we can continue with our programming in online format and in person. So without further ado, our speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really glad and honored to collaborate with your extremely interesting webinar, and well, I hope you will enjoy. As you know, the Christianization of the Slavs took place throughout several centuries, from the 8th until the 12th century, in different geographic areas, mostly in a forced and vertical way, upside down, starting with the baptism of the prince or ruler and following with the compulsory conversion of his whole kingdom. As a consequence, certain rituals and practices from the Slavic pre-Christian religion were preserved long after the official Christianization, as attested by diverse medieval homiletic and juridical sources condemning those unorthodox customs. This circumstance had as a result a conflict between the old and the new rites. Among those rites, the funerary and fertility rituals and festivals played an essential role in the agricultural society of the ancient Slavs. That is why they were deeply rooted in the community life as well as in the collective mentality, and they were especially hard to eradicate. They collided directly with the Christian practices and concretely in particular periods of the Orthodox liturgical calendar, such as Lent and the Easter in the spring, when some of those pre-Christian rites and festivals overlapped with the Christian ones. Such is the case of the food offerings and banqueting during the festival of Radunitsa related to the cult of the dead, coinciding with the Orthodox fasting before Easter among the East Slavs. In spite of the ban of the ecclesiastic authorities, people kept on performing some of those practices in the popular religion. However, although most of the pre-Christian practices and festivals have been eradicated, some of them are still performed even nowadays, being integrated in the Christian Orthodox practices. Regarding the funerary rituals, let's see if I can move here to the next here. Yeah, the funerary rituals among the East Slavs, one of the most characteristic elements was a funerary banquet that was celebrated to honor the deceased. Actually, the earliest and most reliable testimony of an Eastern Slavic funerary rite can be found in Ibn Rusta's Book of Precious Gems, a 10th century Persian historian and geography, a kind of geography encyclopedia or something like this. So as you can see, thanks to the fact that the Persian author thought that Slavic customs were scandalous, we know that the usual rite among the Slavs was cremation, something that violated the idea that he had on the sanctity of corpses, in accordance with Muslim religion. In addition to cremation, the funerary ritual included ritualized self-harm of the deceased man's wives. The fact that the latter had more than one wife indicates that the person was a member of the Eastern Slavic aristocracy. The rite also marks a ritualization of the time following cremation. The next morning, the ashes are gathered and put inside an urn that is buried in a mound. It thus becomes the space devoted to the living memory of the deceased, where the ceremonies for his commemoration are celebrated. The act of putting the ashes inside an urn that is buried in a mound has several Indo-European parallels. It was done in the ancient Greek tradition with Patroclus and with Achilles, for instance, in Homer's Iliad, and in Odyssey also, or in the Germanic tradition with Harald, the king of Norway, according to the testimony of Saxo Grammaticus. In the Vedic tradition, in old ancient India, the bones were collected a few days after cremation and were put inside a jar that could also be placed in a mound. According to the testimony of Ibn Rusta, 1 year later, an offering of honey is made, an element that becomes a symbol of immortality because of its physical characteristic of incorruptibility. Together with this offering, a funerary banquet is held to honor the deceased. Funerary banquets, such as the one described by Ibn Rusta, were common. It is important to mention that he makes on the date when they took place, exactly 1 year after the relative's death in whose honor it was celebrated. Abundant parallels can be found also for ritualized funerary banquets in the Indo-European domain. For instance, people from ancient India honor the deceased called pitaras, for fathers, on the anniversary of the death, during which a ritual cake was prepared and invocations were made so that the dead could find their way to the other world. In Athens, the ritualized banquet was celebrated on special dates, specifically on the third day of Anthesterias, during a festival called Hitroi. The Romans also held a banquet called Silicernium shortly after the funerary rite. In addition to this banquet, a feast called Kenanovendialis was held on the 9th day after the funerals, and it marked the family's return to social life, interrupted during the time of the mourning. The most important annual remembrance for the Romans to honor the deceased or the family was the parentalia. But coming back to the Slavs, the testimony of Ibn Rusta on the burial practice of cremation associated to a funerary banquet coincides with the information that can be found in the Powiesvremenichliet, the tale of bygone years or primary chronicle, the oldest chronicle, East Slavic chronicle, dating back to the 12th century, the beginning of the 12th century, but based on earlier materials. And here, summarizing the information that we have here in this text, on the well, we can see that the banquet or this funeral rite is called trisna in the original Church Slavonic text. And this allows us to identify a set of characteristic common features, namely the presence of many warriors, the consumption of alcohol to the point of drunkenness, the construction of a mount on the grave, and the widow's lament for the dead husband. All this can be found also in the Powies-Wymenich in the following description belonging to the story of Princess Olga of Kiev, as you know, of course, her third revenge against the murderers of her husband, the Prince Igor, those Drevlians, this Slavic tribe, in 945. Well, as you already may know, the text is very interesting since it gives a detailed account of the aforementioned practices. Banqueting to honor the deceased was a basic way of feasting the death of a relative. It was useful ultimately in order to celebrate being alive, as well as to strengthen the family and reinforce social cohesion. In addition, showing respect for the deceased, which could be understood as a kind of cult to the ancestors. In this sense, in the text quoted from the Powies-Wymenich, the celebration made by the Kievan people, a celebration of being alive also, is set against the punishment inflicted on the Drevlians, who were massacred by taking advantage of the drunken state. There is only one action that does not appear in this excerpt, the self-immolation of the widow. On the contrary, here the widow's lament seems to replace the act of killing herself or sacrificing herself. Perhaps Olga's heroic character makes her special enough not to have to sacrifice herself on her husband's grave, or the long and complex revenge exempts her from self-immolation, being replaced in this case by the ritualized triple sacrifice of her husband's murderers. First of all, buried alive in a boat, as we will see later, burned alive in a bathhouse, and secondly, and massacred while drunk during the funeral banquet in the third place, as we see here. The widow's lament could be a softened or literary equivalent of the ritualized self-injuries of which even Rusta spoke. Moreover, the expression she wept for her husband leads us to suggest the possible existence of a ritual funeral lament or thread on the dead husband's tomb. Unfortunately, we do not have any further textual information except perhaps from the lament of Yaroslavna for her wounded husband, Prince Igor Sviatoslavich, as it appears in the 12th century East Slavic epic poem known as Tale of Igor's Campaign. The main difference between Olga and Yaroslavna is that the latter's husband did not die from his wounds, unlike the former's, who was also called Igor. The custom of the widow's lament for her dead husband is very well attested in other Indo-European literary traditions. In the ancient Greek tradition, for example, it is done twice by Andromache on her husband Hector's death in the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. In ancient Indian epics, it is performed by Tara over her husband Valin's body. Coming back to Princess Olga, in the story of her triple revenge against the Derevlians, can be seen also different parts of a pre-Christian funerary rite. The first part of the revenge is related to the burial of the warriors alive in a boat. You can see it here in the passage. The second part here, it deals with the burning alive of the warriors inside of a bathhouse. And the third part, that we already mentioned, corresponds to the killing of the drunk warriors during a banquet. That is, the revenge could be a ritual sacrifice that included the different parts of a pre-Christian funerary rite: burial in a boat, cremation, bath, and banquet. While the burial in a boat could be more related to the Nordic rite of the Varangians, the other elements are well attested among the Slavs. Moreover, according to Vladimir Prob in his monograph on the historical roots of Russian folk tales, the stories of children, either the boy Ivan or a girl called Vasilisa the Beautiful, for instance, could be reflecting the different parts of pre-Christian funerary rite, as reflected by the tasks or the actions ordered by Baba Yaga that the children must complete either to access the 30th kingdom, in the case of Ivan, or to get the magical object, in the case of Vasilisa. These actions included eating the food of Baba Yaga, preparing the bath and heating of the stove for the witch. Actually, eating the food assures the boy Ivan the passage to the other world, just as in other Indo-European mythologies such as Persephone and the pomegranate in Hades. On the contrary, in the case of the girl Vasilisa, it is her magical doll, animated by her deceased mother's soul, who performs the task and eats the food. This is because the girl does not want to remain in the witch's hut, nor to pass to the other world, but to get the magical object and come back home. Still today, the food offerings for the dead play an important role among the South and East Slavs, and among the Poles also. It used to be until the 19th century mostly, with the celebration of a funerary banquet by the grave in the cemetery or the offering of food and drinks to the deceased in the churches and cemeteries. The presence of the dead in daily life and rituals devoted to them is even more evident in the pre-Christian customs that were observed in Christianized societies, and especially among the East Slavs. We already mentioned the funerary banquet. However, another common practice was to honor the dead in the steam baths during a festival called Radunitsa, which coincided with the Christian Easter. It has been attested by several sermons dating back to the 13th and 14th centuries, such as the Sermon on Fasting for the Ignorant on the Monday of the second week, which gives the most detailed description. Here you have the excerpt. It is possible that the action of making the souls of the deceased, or Naviem, come to the steam baths with the offerings of food and drinks could be related to the dryness or the drought of a dead body, which has to be rehydrated by means of libations or, among the East Slavs, using the humidity of bathhouses. But it could be related with the different steps of the funerary ritual, involving the washing of the corpse and the funerary banquet, as well as the cremation. Parallel to the East Slavic Radunitsa, among the West Slavs in the 15th century Polish sermons, here you have the excerpt, can be found a striking coincidence of a food offering for the souls of the dead that are called bosze. Specifically, this refers to the leftovers of the Holy Thursday meal, similar to the way it was done by the East Slavs during the Radunitsa, but without preparing baths for the dead, in the Polish case. Still today, in the Russian Orthodox Church, Radunitsa is celebrated as a commemoration of the departed observed on the second Tuesday after Easter, or in some places in southwest Russia, on the second Monday after Easter. In Ukrainian tradition, it is called provody or paminki, and it involves the eating of symbolic food such as the funeral koliva, dyed eggs, pancakes, honey cookies, and so on. Koliva or kutia is a ritual dish that a type of porridge made of wheat and honey. This dish was eaten on the occasion of different relevant celebrations in the pre-Christian Slavic religion and also in the Orthodox Christian religion and practice nowadays, both during fertility rituals and during the funerary banquets and the festivals to honor the dead. It was referred for the first time in the aforementioned Sermon on the Fasting for the Ignorant from the 13th of 14th century. Here you have this excerpt mentioning the Kutia. And still nowadays in South Slavic countries such as Bulgaria or in East Slavic countries such as Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine, the relatives of the deceased gather together at the cemeteries and celebrate funerary banquets to honor the dead, as we already said. This way, we see how these customs belonging to the pre-Christian religion, and especially those related to the cult of the dead, were strongly rooted in the popular religion and survived the Christianization just by being Christianized. As we have seen, for the Slavs, the soul of the deceased had a material or physical entity, even corporeal, keeping all their physiological needs and the relationship with the living. Already Wienecke coined the expression in German lebenden Leichnam, living bodies, in order to refer to the concept of the dead among the East Slavs. This physical existence or presence of the deceased had a correspondence with the funerary rites as attested both in the earliest medieval sources and in the oral tradition of folklore. Therefore, the soul survival did not take place in the afterlife, but in this very world. And as a consequence, all the dead were in fact the revenant. However, the return had to follow certain rules in order that it was positive for the living, being arranged according to specific rites and performed in particular places and dates. Otherwise, the deceased could be harmful for the living as well as for the cattle and the crops. Hereafter, we will analyze the specific characteristics, both physical and corporeal, that were shown by the dead in the earliest historiographical and homiletic medieval sources regarding the East Slavs, as well as in the oral tradition of the Slavic folklore. The sources regarding the three Slavic areas, East, West, and South, agree in showing, as we already seen, the cremation as the original Slavic burial custom. Such is the case of the aforementioned text of the Persian traveler and geographer Ibn Rustam, and of the East Slavic primary chronicle regarding the East Slavs. As for the South Slavs, the same type of burial custom, together with a ritual killing of human beings, is attested in the passage of the history of Leo the Deacon from the 10th century, actually recounting this battle carried by Prince Sviatoslav of Kiev in 971 that took place in the Danube River. So similarly can be found an allusion to the cremation among the Western Slavs. Here we have the artistic representation depiction by the Polish painter Henryk Santos from the 19th century of this event that is also on the poster of this webinar. And similarly, as I said, there can be found an allusion to the cremation among the Western Slavs in a letter addressed by Saint Boniface to King Ethelbald of the Mercians around the year 745 that describes the burial sacrifice of widows among the Wends. You know, the Wends were the Slavs who lived or inhabited what is now Eastern Germany and the Baltic coast of Eastern Germany and Poland. So in this text, as we just said, the ritual sacrifice of the widow is linked to the cremation as the burial custom. Similarly, the ritual sacrifice of the widow was reported among the East Slavs by the aforementioned Ibn Rustam, Book of Precious Gems, though in a different way. First, in a symbolic way by cutting her hands and face with a knife, and secondly, in an explicit description of a voluntary suicide by hanging herself. And we can find a similar kind of sacrifice of the widow during her husband's burial among the South Slavs, as it is told by the Strategikon from the 6th century, attributed to the Byzantine Emperor Maurice. Like this, all the medieval extant sources coincide in describing the burial ritual in all the Slavic areas as the cremation of the corpse, closely linked with the sacrifice of the widow. However, there is a parallel testimony from the same Ibn Rustam Book of Precious Gems regarding the customs of the Rus that curiously does not include the cremation, but still contains the sacrifice of the widow. Here you can read it, that with him, with the corpse of the husband in the tomb, they place his wife, whom he loved, and they close the door of the tomb of her while she is still alive, and there she dies. So it's terrible also, but it does not include cremation, only inhumation alive. She is buried alive together with the corpse of her husband. Well, it is surprising, especially if we bear in mind that the Rus belonged to the Scandinavian culture, where the cremation was a well-known burial custom. And moreover, if we consider the famous testimony of another 10th century Arab traveler, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, the really famous, who in his Kitab Ilamul Kalsakaliba, book for the honors of the Slavs, written on the Rusia, settled by the river Volga, describes in great detail the burial of one of their chieftains, including a sheep cremation and the human sacrifice of the slave girl. It is really actually the most detailed description of the funerary ritual of a, let's say, Varangian or Rus, as it has come down to us. And you can have also, of course, this artistic depiction of the Polish painter Henryk Santos from of this episode from the end of the 19th century. Well, coming back to the testimony of the primary chronicle or Powies of Vremenich-Lied, speaking on the burial customs of the East Slavs, it mentioned already in this excerpt, it mentioned also an urn set upon a post by the roadside where the bones and ashes were placed after the cremation of the corpse. It reminds me at least very much this artistic depiction of the Russian artist Nikolai Roerich, this Izba Smierti, this, the little house of the death. And also, according to Rybakov, it reminds also to the house of Baba Yaga, this house in the East Slavic fairy tales, who dwelt deep in the forest in a hut standing on chicken legs. Well, it could be related also as a symbolic depiction of this, let's say, funerary urn, because we will see that also this character, this folk character of Baba Yaga, could be related as a kind of guardian of the entrance of those heroes of the folk tales into the other world, this 30th kingdom. Also, as we mentioned before, that bearing in mind that all the actions and the tasks that they had to perform inside of the hut, as ordered by the witch, they were related or could be related to the different steps of a funerary pre-Christian ritual or so. So also the same house, the hut, could be a kind of depiction of this funerary urn or so. But well, this is just a theory. It is just an interpretation, of course. Well, the burials in isolated places, such as forests and fields, as well as crossroads, can be found also among the West Slavs, in the Czechs in this case, as it is attested by Cosmas of Prague in the Chronica Bohemorum, the Chronicle of the Czechs. And they can be due either to the need of physical separation of the living and the dead, or to the sacred character of forests and fields, as well as to the liminary character of crossroads that, together with rivers, could play an important role in the rites of passage. In this excerpt, it was mentioned also a pagan festivity that started on the eve of Pentecost and finished 1 week later on the eve of the Trinity Sunday, in what was called the Semik or Rusalnaya Nedelia among the East Slavs. Here we have also a depiction from this Russian Lubok of the 19th century of Semik. And this similar holiday with the designation with the name of Rusali was first attested among the Balkan Slavs by authors like Theodore Balsamon and Demetrios Homatenos from the 12th and 13th centuries. The word Rusali would come from the Latin Rosalia, the Roman festival of Dies Rosae, the Day of Roses. And the Rusali was an ancient fertility festival celebrated in early June and closely linked with the cult of the dead and the spring agricultural rites. Among the East and South Slavs, there was another festivity to honor the dead that we already mentioned, and that was called Radunica. Here we have also an image from the 17th century from the northern Russia here in this region in the 17th century. And this coincided with the Easter. Despite of that, it implied these respectful songs and dances as well as excessive eating, drinking, and uninhibited sexual behavior. And that is why it was severely condemned by the homiletic and ecclesiastical literature, because it violated the compulsory fasting of Easter. For instance, we have the very well-known, these proceedings of the Council of the 100 Chapters, this also known as Stoglav, this council that was convoked by Tsar Ivan the Terrible in 1551. So there is also an explicit mention of this Radunitsa. And the celebrations that took place during this festival, that were, of course, condemned by these proceedings, still in 16th century. Among the West Slavs in the rural areas of Poland, still up to the 15th century, are attested pre-Christian festivals such as the so-called Stado during the Pentecost, and Dziewana and Maziana coincided with the Laetare Sunday, the fourth Sunday of Lent, according to the testimony of the very well-known also Jan Dlugos, Johannes Longinos in his Latin name, a canon at the Cathedral of Krakow dating back to the end of the 14th and beginning of the 15th century in his Annals or Chronicles of the Illustrious Kingdom of Poland. As you can see, first of all, this Stado look like a kind of, celebrated during Pentecost, looks like a kind of fertility ritual more than funerary or cult of the dead, because of how it is described by this kind of sexual practices of men and women together here, as it is described. And then the other, this ritual called Dziewana and Maziana, celebrated during the Laetare Sunday, that actually it will be this Sunday, next Sunday this year, on, it is the fourth Sunday of Lent before Easter. So it consisted in, in some towns in which the form of a long stick, which is thrown and sung in swamps, let's say. Also a kind of ritual symbolizing maybe the ending of the winter and the beginning of spring. It could be interpreted also like this, with these two divinities, female divinities called Dziewana and Maziana, if I'm not mistaken. Well, the celebration of all these festivals and rituals assure that such supernatural entities would be favorable for the human beings. Otherwise, they could have negative and destructive consequences for the fertility of the earth. We can find a good example in a legend from the region of the river Onega, according to which during the time of troubles, Smutna Evremia in Russian, that is the period of political crisis and instability in the Muscovian state, between the demise of the Ruriki dynasty in 1598 and the establishment of the Romanov dynasty in 1613, some Polish soldiers called pani in this tradition, lords, had died in Russian soil. And every year during the festivity of Semik, this Rusalnaya Nedelia, the people of the region used to gather by the clock tower and take the kisiel, a drink made of forest fruits or grains, in order to keep calm those dead men. One year, they forgot to accomplish the ritual, and there was a bad harvest. Since then, they never forgot to calm the wicked pani through the offerings, this kind of drink offering. Moreover, these dead warriors have the additional problem of being foreigners and enemies that have been killed far from their homes, and whose remains do not rest in their fatherland, in this case. Finally, we must not forget that in the East Slavic tradition, just like in Western European traditions, the dead can also be aggressive towards the living, and can be found a spectacular example in the primary chronicle. As you will see, you may know also, of course, when it narrates a massive ghostly apparition that would have taken place in the city of Polotsk in the year 1092, in the context of a great surge of prodigies and signs that would announce the imminent end of the world, together with the invasion of the Polovtsian enemies. Such incident, here we are faced to a violent apparition of those Navi, as they are called also in this Church Slavonic original of the primary chronicle, the souls of the dead that seemed to be peaceful while they were visiting the houses of the living and were taking their drinks, foods, and baths. However, they share with them some features. They are invisible and can only be seen the footprints that they leave, in this case, the hoofs of their horses. But unlike the other, these Navi kill the people with their wounds. The reason of this behavior can be found in the following context. Besides the apocalyptic context, this apparition coincides with several violent attacks launched by the Polovtsians, a nomad people of Turkic origin that came from the steppes of Central Asia, invading the territory of Kievan Rus in 1068. The same as in the legend of the Polish Pani, here we have a foreigner invading host that dies in enemy land after having killed many natives. Like this, they accomplish all the conditions to become harmful restless dead, being the ghostly army a reflection of the invading troops, though they were far away. Besides, we can find one of the negative effects typical of the restless dead among the apocalyptic signs. That year there was a severe drought, as well as many fires, and they had a physical effects on the bodies of the living in the form of wounds. Just like in other aspects of the Slavic pre-Christian religion, this kind of apparition is not an exception nor an isolated event. On the contrary, it is an early example of the phenomenon known in French as chasse sauvage, in English, wild hunt. And it is attested there can be found many examples of this supernatural event in the Western medieval literature, coming back this tradition to the Germanic and Scandinavian myths also. But we don't have time here to mention all of them. Well, still among the East Slavs, another example of the problematic and harmful effect of the deceased is to be found in the 16th century, this sermon against the impious superstition hated by God of those who think that the burial of those who have drawn or have murdered is harmful for the growing of the crops because of the frost that was written by this cleric, this Maxim the Greek, in the 15th century Muscovy. And well, it deals with this alleged harmful effect. It's in the title that the burial of those who have drawn or have been murdered is thought to have on the fertility of earth. According to this work, if freezing winds flow during spring, then if we know that a man who had either drawn or been married recently has been buried, we exhume him and abandon him in a distant place. It is condemned, of course, by this Greek cleric in Muscovy in the 16th century. Therefore, in both examples, the deceased had problematic deaths or lacked the appropriate funerary rites. We can link this testimony of Maxim the Greek with an older passage from the PVL, from Povius Vremenigliet, dealing with the lack of an appropriate funerary rite as a punishment for two sorcerers from Yaroslav who headed the rebellion in Bielorussia in the year 1071. They could be considered double problematic deceased in their condition of murderers and sorcerers, also wizards or sorcerers. This way, according to the account of the Povius Vremenigliet, they were hanged from an oak and left there unburied until a bear devoured their bodies. We could see here the oak tree as the sacred place of justice linked to the god of thunder, who was called Perun, as you know, among the East Slavs. It was the sacred tree also, and the justice was also the function of this supreme god, this sovereign god of among the East Slavs. And the hanging as a likely ritual method of execution, leaving their corpses unburied to the beasts in order to avoid the inhumation of the bodies, something that could imply negative consequences for the community, bearing in mind the problematic nature of sorcerers, even in the afterlife for the Slavic mentality. Finally, an example of a preventive action, maybe if could be interpreted so, although not that evident, can be found among the East Slavs in a passage of the Povius Vremenigliet, that relates the funeral ritual of Prince Volodymyr of Kiev after his death in 1015. Well, it would be hard to explain this strange funerary ritual performed with Prince Volodymyr's body if we dismiss the Slavic pre-Christian rites. Something really shocking if we remember that Volodymyr was the first Kievan ruler to be officially baptized in 988, converting his kingdom to the Christian faith. Firstly, the hole that is drilled in the floor between two chambers in order to remove the prince's corpse would have been done to confound maybe the deceased. This can be linked maybe to the custom of removing a body through a hole made for that purpose, which in Belarusian is called dushnik, from the word dusha, the soul. The aim of this could be to disorient the souls of the dead and to prevent them from returning home and becoming vampires or harmful dead. Also, maybe the action of wrapping the corpse in a carpet could be also with the purpose, could be done with the purpose of immobilize, how do you say, in order that the dead could not move and not to become a restless dead, that he could not, to avoid that he could come back home as well. And also maybe the mention of the sledge here, placing the corpse on a sledge is highly symbolic, especially if we bear in mind that when Prince Vladimir died on July 15th, according to the PVL, there was no snow at all. It was summer. Therefore, the sledge can be interpreted as a symbolic means of transport for the soul of the deceased to the other world, the same as the boat for the Vikings, for instance, or the Varangians. In conclusion, we can say that the corporeity of the dead among the East Slavs shows parallel characteristics with other Slavic and Indo-European traditions, either regarding the burial customs or the features and behavior of the dead, as well as the festivities devoted to them. But especially among the Slavic peoples and Slavic tradition, we can see very strong this link with linking or relating together the fertility of the earth and the cult of the dead. Maybe because the earth actually was the place where finally the remains of the dead, of the deceased, were to be put or to rest. Maybe this is because of this link, actually, this special emphasis in these cults of the fertility and cults of funerary rituals, of the cult of the dead. And finally, the replacement of the funerary rite of cremation for the inhumation or burial of the body after the Christianization could have provoked a culture shock among the Slavs that had a reflection in all the stories of living dead and vampires in Central and Eastern Europe, as it will be recounted by my colleague, Professor Juan Antonio Álvarez Pedrosa, in a next webinar. So that's all for the moment. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have questions or comments, so please let me know.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Marinas. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the third of our webinars. We still have one more, and the last webinar in the series is coming on April 15th. It will be, the topic of that webinar will be restless death and Slavic gods and goddesses of death in the underworld. And it will be provided by Dr. Juan Antonio Álvarez Pedrosa. So everybody is invited. And now, Dr. Marinas, would you be able to answer this question?
Sure. Actually, it's a honor because it's Professor Florin Curta. Yes, of course, that is really interesting, the question that he's making through the chat. Yes, he said that much information that I was offering derives from relatively late written sources. And as I mentioned, the early source to mention the sacrifice of the widow among the Sclavines and the ants is the Strategikon, 7th century. However, there is no archaeological evidence for that. nor is there any evidence in the form of pottery remains or the funeral banquet by the grave. So how do I explain this discrepancy between the archaeological and the historical sources? And also, if I could the second question, if could the Latin name of the festival Rosalia be transmitted to the Southern Slavs, linguistically speaking? Well, actually, yes. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a historian, and of course, I deal with the text, the historical text, and of course, the folklore. So, is well, of course, you are right that the third source, the most important source, is archaeology, of course. And as the most important thing is all of the sources that we have for maybe let's say studying the Slavic Pre-Christian religion. So we have to take into account this archaeology, of course. And what do have, for instance, I'm not sure about the cremation. If we don't have, I don't know actually, if we have this evidence from the archaeology of this cremation as the main source. I think so, that we have this, but I don't have the data in order to answer that we have the archaeological evidence in order to prove this, at least the cremation as the the funerary ritual. Of course, you mentioned the sacrifice of the widow, no, the cremation. So you are right. As far as it does not appear these kind of sacrifices of widows, of women together with their husbands in different mounds or tombs, we cannot. Okay. Yes, he's saying, Professor Kurta, that we do have evidence of cremation burials. Yes. Okay, but he was referring in the former question to this sacrifice of the widow, of course. So as far as we don't have the evidence from the archaeology, at least what we have is the coincidence from all the different Slavic areas. So both east, west, and south. Of course, until we don't have the archaeology evidence, we cannot be sure, completely sure. So it lacks this evidence for this detail that is this very well attested by different sources in different areas. You're right. And well, regarding the Latin name of the festival Rosalia, yes, it could be actually well, maybe this how can I say this linguistic long word, but actually that could be reinterpreted through a Slavic word, especially those rusalki, or those beings related to the waters, supernatural beings, also hybrid beings. Actually, my colleague, Professor Juan Antonio Alvarez Pedrosa, will speak about them. Could be related also to other supernatural beings, such as Vili and Beregini, maybe. But in the East Slavic form, rusalki, maybe there was a kind of, cross of the words coming from Latin and mixing together with the Slavic languages. But actually, I cannot tell you. I cannot tell you if this was maybe the Latin origin and mixed together with the Slavic languages, this root. But I'm not sure about it, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So I have maybe too specific of a question, but I sort of intriguing, because it also relates to my discipline, which is food and nutrition. You mentioned that one of the foods that was used during the funeral rites is kutia. And there is grain and honey, and I believe sometimes it also contains poppy seeds. Do you know if those ingredients have any symbolic meaning when we are looking at the funeral rites? What they symbolize?
Well, at least I think so. At least the same as honey, because of the incorruptibility of honey, and it preserves very well. But especially, how to call the grain, the foods made of grain like porridge and so. It can be related, of course, to the fertility of earth. So it is together with fertility rituals and funerary rituals mixing together. Maybe this symbolic. Also, you know, the grain and this symbolic, value or meaning of the how to show the seeds, as in this, these traditions, Indo-European traditions of the cycle of maybe rebirth, with the seed, as it was also very well known in this, how do you call, Eleusis, the rites of the Eleusis in ancient Greece.
Yes.
Also centered or focused on this symbolic value of the the seeds and the grain. Maybe it is, but it is just my interpretation. I'm not sure, but just as an interpretation.
Yeah, it's certainly makes sense. So I have another question that is related to the discrepancy between the time of celebrating the dead in the modern world versus what you were discovering in your text. So I believe sometimes during our conversation we talk about the holiday of Zaduszki in November. So this is how the celebration of death looks right now. Where this transition between Marzanna or Dziewanna in the times around Easter versus moving the celebration into the fall, how did this happen? What's the link?
Yeah. Yes, actually, I don't know when it happened in Poland, for instance, because you're right that it coincides right now with the 1st and 2nd of November, this Zaduszki, And but actually, some of the practices reminded very much those of the ancient times, as attested by the text.
Yeah.
Also, both the banquet or the food offerings, and also, lighting these bonfires in order to attract the souls of the dead, also in Poland, and so not only the candles but also bonfires, in order to attract the souls of the dead, and maybe to warm the souls of the dead, maybe just a bit similar like the baths of the dead attested in the bathhouses there in the sermons, East Slavic sermons from the 13th and 14th centuries. But well, when did it take place? I'm not sure, but what it looks like, I'm not sure about it, but it looks like that the ancient customs were, let's say, delayed in order to maybe accomplish the Christian, the Catholic, in this case, calendar, because you know that the holiday of All Saints and the souls of the dead, it was, let's say, a Western European introduction into Christendom, in medieval times. If I'm not mistaken, it was in the 11th, I think, century. It is related in Orderic Vital, this French cleric, and so. I think this let's say, Western European introduction of this feast in order to commemorate the saints, the All Saints, and also the souls of the dead. Maybe I think that in Poland they had to, let's say, accomplish or this new calendar, let's say. But I'm not sure when it took place. Actually, I cannot tell you in Poland.
And the last question that I saw is about the differences between the Western, Eastern, and the South Slavs. So it seems like the differences are significant in the way how they celebrate their dead. Is there any explanation why there's such a difference between all the Slavs?
Yeah, for instance, you mean the rituals regarding the differences regarding the widow, the sacrifice of the widow. Yeah, for
exactly.
instance. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, because actually it's the most shocking difference. Some of them are buried alive in some of the text.
Yeah.
In others are hanged, or in others are burned alive. Maybe it is when there is no complete agreement between all of the areas, maybe as maybe also related to the question of Professor Florin Curta, no? When there is a phenomenon that cannot be attested in every Slavic area with a full coincidence in all of those elements, maybe it means that it is not really old or really ancient, that it is a kind of innovation, but we cannot be sure, especially if it is not attested, as he said, by the archaeological evidence. Maybe those differences could be explained actually by the late character of this phenomenon. I'm not sure, but it could be maybe I don't know, as how to say it, a clue, maybe a clue that it's not really old, it is not really ancient because of the differences. It is not a common way of sacrifice of the widow among all of the Slavic areas. And if there is not archaeological evidence, it is suspicious, maybe. It's Slavic character.
Yeah, so over the different seminars, that unfortunately one thing becomes very clear, that the evidence when we are talking about Slavs is really very thin.
Yeah, sure. It is, unfortunately, we don't have this direct and contemporary testimonies that we have in other ancient traditions. So always we have to rely on these indirect and late testimonies, of course, and who are not objective at all. They are biased by Christian or Muslim other faiths. So, and especially if there is not the archaeological evidence to support it, so we always has the doubt to doubt them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even with Jan Długosz, which is one of the oldest Polish written accounts, he wrote everything about 100 years after that happened. Yeah. So he wasn't obviously a witness to those happenings. Our 1 hour draws to the end, so it will be time to say goodbye. But before we part, I would like to thank you, Dr. Marinas, and thank you all of you for participation. Please remember about the little survey that you would like you to complete. Our next meeting is on April 15th. This, unfortunately, it will be the last one in this series. And if you are interested in the resources that Dr. Marinas used in the webinar and the things that he cited, his slides and the handout that he prepared in addition to this webinar will be also posted on our website, on the center website. If you cannot find it, or if you are very eager to have them right away, please email me directly. It's agatak@ufl.edu. Or you can contact also the center main office and somebody will help you. So thank you. Thank you, Dr. Martinez. And I will see you all in April. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.